Welcome everyone to the research seminar here at the Institute for Futures Studies. Today, the research seminar is part of and the beginning of a workshop titled Contemporary Perspectives on Conservatism, an interdisciplinary workshop, which is run by the project Conservative Climate Justice, a project that I'm leading. And today's speaker is Emily Jones. She's a lecturer in modern British history at the University of Manchester and fellow of the Royal Historical Society and the Higher Education Academy. She has a DPhil in history at the University of Oxford from 2017 with a dissertation on or titled Edmund Burke and the Invention of Modern Conservatism in Intellectual History that was also published by Oxford University Press, and for which you won the Longman History Today Book Prize and were selected a Financial Times Book of the Year. Her research now focuses on the intellectual and political history of the 19th and 20th century Britain, presently on the development of ideas about conservatism as an intellectual and political tradition. And you're currently working on your new book, One Nation, the Disraeli Myth and the Making of Conservative Tradition, on which I guess that parts of this talk will be based.
I've just submitted the manuscript, so
congratulations. So the title of today's talk is Afterlives, Edmund Burke, Benjamin Disraeli, and the Invention of Modern Conservatism. And before the talk, I just want to say that questions, please save them for the Q&A session that follows after the talk. But if you have clarificatory questions, raise your hand and we'll take them when we see fit. And for the online audience, please write in the chat if you have a question of clarification. So please join me in welcoming Emily Jones. The floor is yours.
So thank you very much for coming. Thank you for Eric for inviting me to speak to you, and for Daniel and Tove and Michaela and everyone for all of your help getting me here. So as you will have gathered, I'm a historian who is specifically interested in the kind of construction and kind of reconstruction of modern political ideologies, particularly conservatism. That said, I don't see myself as a historian of conservatism with either a big or a small c, but more broadly, a kind of a historian of a broader time period. So the 19th and 20th centuries, primarily in Britain, but not exclusively. I've looked at sources from elsewhere in Europe and in North America. And in my work, I ask critical historical questions, such as when did this happen? How did this come to be? And how did this idea gain and retain power? Hence, unlike most people, I do not date 1790 in the publication of Edmund Burke's Reflections on the Revolution in France as the founding moment of conservatism. Instead, what I asked myself when I began my PhD, which is now my first book, was when and how did the commonly understood, almost kind of bullet point understanding of Burkean conservatism and Burke's thought more generally come into being? As many of you will know, Burkean conservatism is usually summarised as a belief in the organic nature of society and politics, hence a dislike of mechanical, abstract thinking as applied to practical politics, reverence for history and tradition, and respect for religion, property, and order. My second book asks a similar question of the Anglo-Jewish conservative Prime Minister Benjamin Disraeli, and how after his death in 1881, he was mythologized as the founder of what eventually became known as One Nation conservatism. So Disraelian or One Nation conservatism is usually summarized or kind of used to signal a belief in a kind of holistic, socially minded brand of conservatism, which claims sympathy towards social harmony and social problems, seeking to promote social peace and unity, usually in order to preserve existing institutions and systems of power. But I'd like you to try to forget what you think you might know about Burke and Disraeli and their relative kind of thinker adjectives, so Burkean and Disraelian. Burke and Disraeli and their kind of respective thinker adjectives meant different things to different people at different times. In their lifetimes, politics was structured entirely differently around entirely different, predominantly constitutional questions, rather than those of modern party systems and questions of welfare and economic management. For many decades, after his death in 1797, Burke, Irishman, Whig thinker and politician, was seen to be an inconsistent madman who had split his party over the French Revolution. To be Burkean in Britain for much of the 19th century referred to a tendency to fly off into a passionate rage, throwing daggers onto the floor of the House of Commons, rather than the kind of moderate, gradual organicism that we associate with the term today. Likewise, although Disraeli was celebrated by many after his death, throughout his career he was subjected to persistent attacks for his supposed opportunism, inconsistency, and lack of principle, which were so often refracted through a lens of Orientalism and anti-Semitism. In death, to his opponents, Disraeli remained an insincere poser. A reference to Disraeli at this time definitely did not imply an inclination towards social welfare policies or an immediate reference to the phrase taken from his now very famous 1845 Condition of England novel Sybil on the two divided nations of the rich and the poor, as it does today. So how did these transformations happen? And what can these histories tell us, not only about the nature of conservatism, but the role that history and historical reconstruction has itself played in shaping modern political thought and practice? What I want to do in this short paper is to provide some of the insights that taking this kind of reception history approach, that is by kind of tracing the active uses and reinterpretations of political thinkers and figures, to understand how ideas gain and retain power, and how modern political ideologies were invented and reinvented. Hence, a reception history approach can also provide unique insight into our contemporary politics too. So I'll start off chronologically. I am a historian with Burke. I'll move on to Disraeli, and then I want to, the third section, I want to kind of do some comparative reflections. This is very, very truncated because I'm basically summarising two books. So as discussed, very happy to go into more detail in the questions. So Edmund Burke did not found modern conservatism as we understand it today in his own lifetime. As I've already suggested, for decades after his death, his legacy, especially in Britain and in Ireland, his legacy was unclear and uncertain. His oeuvre is obviously vast. His attempted impeachment of Warren Hastings, the Governor-General of India, his Irishness. So he was an Anglican, but he kind of lived in a kind of Catholic milieu, and suspected Catholic connections, including a last-minute deathbed conversion, which was always rumoured. And especially his 1770 work, Cause on the Thoughts of the Present Discontents, which promoted a kind of Whiggish party politics over a Tory royal prerogative, was hailed as the Whig manual for decades after his death, and all of this ensured Tory hostility for decades. Assertions that in splitting the Whigs over the French Revolution, Burke had kept his party out of power for 40 years, and that by the time of his death he was this kind of inconsistent madman, meant that a really vast amount of critical recovery was needed for his thought, for him to essentially be seen as a consistent political thinker, for this thought to then be labelled small c conservative, and then for his thought and politics to be aligned what would eventually become a kind of modern British Conservative Party. And we can see this is probably one of the most famous examples of Burke's kind of madness. So this is the historian Henry Thomas Buckle's History of Civilization in England. This idea that how sad it was that a man such as Burke, to us it is only given to mourn over such noble a wreck. This is in the 1860s, so this is a legacy and a reputation that follows Burke for a very long time after his death. So hopefully you'll be asking, how did the transformation happen? So first, on what was termed Burke's Irishness, people in the 19th century were very interested in national character and kind of the traits that these things were supposed to kind of inhabit and kind of give out. So Burke's Irishness was gradually reinterpreted as a positive, passion, imagination, rather than a kind of negative trait, a kind of madness and kind of being given to fly off into these rages by kind of significant literary and cultural critics like Matthew Arnold. And Burke's supposedly Irish traits from the late 1860s were reframed as a positive attribute, which brought imagination and foresight to a kind of more pragmatic English politics and political thought more generally. So Burke was increasingly seen not as a passionate madman, but this kind of wise prophetic statesman who had kind of foreseen much and had successfully blended distinct national characteristics, being an Irishman working within a kind of British and English Parliament. At the same time, younger liberal intellectuals began to see Burke as an important and consistent thinker who held a significant place in what was now termed for the first time intellectual history. Important critical works were published, including John Morley's Edmund Burke, so he produces one in 1867 and then one at the end of the 1870s, which recognised the significant contributions Burke had made to the history of ideas. Burke's moment in the limelight really came, however, with the debates over Irish Home Rule and the Liberal Prime Minister William Gladstone's conversion to the cause in December 1885. In an extraordinary, imagine this happening today. So in the second reading of the bill, Gladstone comes out to the House of Commons and said, I've read Burke and I have used Burke to come to my conclusions, and so should you. And they actually do. So this kind of starts this huge kind of Burke reading kind of revolution. This causes a rift between the Irish Home Rule as a policy more broadly, so devolution, causes a rift between the Liberals who support Gladstone, those who oppose Home Rule, who see Home Rule as inconsistent with the core liberal principles of civil and religious liberty. And to cut a long story short, the Liberal Unionists who break from the Gladstonians use Burke in an entirely different way. And in the end, they win Burke. They win Burke. So Burke becomes a kind of proto-liberal unionist. The liberal unionists then permanently break from the Gladstonian liberals and shortly align with the Conservatives as the unionists. This modernisation of Burke, which narrowed, moulded and aligned his thought with contemporary politics and labels, didn't happen in isolation, however. From the 1890s, academic and philosophical discussions that were rooted in idealist and historicist mindsets began to reimagine Burke as an early example of what were then kind of post-Darwin and lots of other evolutionary thinkers, increasingly popular evolutionary and organic ways and ideas of framing political and social arguments. So birth, growth, decay, degeneration, society as an organism, these kind of terms. It's in this period that these become popular. Yet Burke was clearly no Democrat. And in the altered context of the early 20th century politics, his thought was increasingly defined as organic and gradualist, but for more progressive readers who were more supportive of further democratisation, he was deemed to be limited and insufficient and therefore was labelled a small c conservative. Despite these significant developments, for Burke to become the founder of modern conservatism, this required conservatives themselves claiming Burke. By the turn of the 20th century in Britain, this was a really extraordinary period in the kind of invention and consolidation of a variety of isms that we now call kind of modern political ideologies. In the face of international competition, a kind of nascent labour movement and widespread strike activity, women's suffrage campaigns, and a resurgent kind of concern about the condition and the health of the people, both in the nation and in the empire. The traditional kind of constitutional agenda of British politics began to feel insufficient, and party political principles underwent a substantial intellectual makeover. And it's in this context that Burke is established definitively for the first time as the founder of modern conservatism. He's given that specific title, in which a history of party based on the native British constitutional tradition, which had set the agenda for much of the 19th century, if not longer, was partially sidelined in favour of tracing a new historical genealogy back to the French Revolution. Burke might not have been a Tory in the strict sense of the term, but by this point it was now possible to convincingly position a Whig as the founder of modern conservatism with both a big and a small c. And you can see this in Lord Hugh Cecil's conservatism. So in Burke, conservatism found its first and perhaps greatest teacher, gave to the conservative movement the dignity of a philosophical creed. Burke is commonly regarded as a Whig and Pitt as a Tory, but this is a misapprehension. Burke was a conservative all of his life. And the reviews of Cecil's work essentially confirm this position too. And Cecil's conservatism is one of many texts that are kind of published at this time that do similar things. Cecil's text in particular becomes very well known. It goes through several republications throughout the 20th century. It's also drawn on during the Cold War, when American conservatives who start to use that term in a meaningful way for the first time, who are interested in drawing on an Anglo, kind of what becomes known as an Anglo-American tradition, or kind of English and Irish writers, go back to these Edwardian texts like Cecil and others when they're kind of constructing their traditions of conservatism too. Hence, it was an interpretation that really stuck. And as well as kind of, Kirk and others, this conservative Burke, as the last chapter of my book shows, was really taught very widely to a whole raft of students in schools, in universities, in Britain, but also all around the world. This late 19th century and early 20th century context is also really important for the mythologization of Disraeli as an alternative conservative hero. So as I've already mentioned, Disraeli's character, his works, his politics, including his many novels, were subjected to repeated anti-Semitic attacks throughout his life that suggested that that stressed his supposed opportunism, his slipperiness, and his lack of principle. Yet he's now most commonly positioned as the founder of this kind of distinctive socially minded tradition of conservatism, usually referred to as One Nation. Again, understanding how this transformation happened required not only understanding how the historic Disraeli's politics were reshaped in order to speak to modern political issues and legitimate particular policy proposals, but how his character, including his Jewishness, were reimagined, and how certain novels, including Sybil, not usually taken to be kind of defining texts in the history of political thought, were extracted and canonized as significant literary, historical, and political texts. Tracing this has allowed me to see how invoking Burke became a powerful and canonical source of conservative principles, statesmanship, and policy justification, but also not just for conservatives, but provided lots of ammunition for conservative rivals. So taken with Burke, Disraeli became an alternative, though complementary, founder or sometimes prophet of conservatism. Sometimes they were kind of platted together and used side by side. Sometimes they were kind of picked up and put down separately. Unlike Burke, Disraeli did at least have the credentials of having been a Conservative Prime Minister. So after his death, Disraeli was already aligned with the right party, unlike Burke. And despite his opponents' suspicion of him, even after his death, Disraeli's mythologization within the Conservative Party begins very rapidly after his death in 1881, with the founding of the Primrose League in 1883. So the Primrose League is founded by Lord Randolph Churchill, so Winston's dad, and others in Disraeli's memory, and is probably the most successful mass organisation of its time. So before the First World War, membership of the Primrose League stood at around 2 million members. And beyond the annual pilgrimages that you can see on the day of his death, so it's coming up April the 19th, if you can get to a Disraeli statue in time. Annual pilgrimages on the day of his death, usually to a statue, not always. Magic lantern shows, the erection of statues themselves, lots of material culture, pin badges, toothpaste boxes, all kinds of little trinkets, perfect for, the age of conspicuous consumption. There were paintings, magazines, so much stuff. But as well as all of this, Disraeli's speeches and his writings became regular sources for kind of extraction for speakers at the many Primrose League meetings, including the annual meeting, which was always held at the Albert Hall. And it was here that Disraeli's tripartite definition of conservatism as maintenance in the Constitution, empire, and the welfare of the people was taken as the gold standard for many decades to come. On Disraeli's Jewishness, so sympathetic biographers who had their own kind of crises of faith and had a kind of muddled sense of their own kind of faith and spirituality in the 19th century, including very well-known historians like J.A. Froude, portrayed Disraeli's faith extremely sensitively. So increasingly, they argued that Disraeli's kind of muddled blend of Judaism and Christianity was in fact a sincere and permissible personal faith. Secondly, these biographers drew from 19th century understandings of Old Testament prophets as the kind of national leaders of the Israelites to argue that Disraeli used his Jewish faith and his own sense of Jewish exceptionalism in a way that had brought great benefits to Britain and her empire. And this new reading of Disraeli's Jewishness found fame most prominently of all in the 1911 play and later Oscar-winning Hollywood film, Disraeli, which comes out in 1929. And I would love to talk more about this in the questions, if you like, because it is an astonishing story. So Disraeli tells the thrilling story of the snap purchase of Suez Canal shares in 1875. And in the play and in the film, the alien Jew, quote, Disraeli, is pitted against the narrow-minded English head of the Bank of England, who dislikes Disraeli based on his Jewishness and fails to see the significance of the purchase of the canal shares for the empire. So by the end of the play, Disraeli kind of emerges as this kind of great visionary leader and by far the better citizen. It was a smash hit on the West End, Broadway, across North America, including in Canada. In the 20s as an early silent film production, and then at the end of the 20s, Warner Brothers picks it up to make an early talkie version with Arliss in the starring role, as he had been in the play. Arliss becomes the best actor to win an Oscar. Sorry, the best British actor to win an Oscar. It takes over $1.5 million at the box office. And by the time of its 1930 re-release, Disraeli had been seen and cheered by over 170 million people speaking 24 different languages. Disraeli, the play and film, therefore had a massive transatlantic audience over a 30-year period, and its influence outlived even the 1956 Suez Crisis. It was, for example, reported in the New York Times that the various Disraeli productions were the inspiration behind Ronald Reagan's designation of his Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, as My Disraeli. So So Disraeli was increasingly mythologized as a great statesman. But how were his principles divined? So a bit like Burke, a few different things happen at around the same time. So as with Burke, and what seems like, at least for me, our own times, there was this sense that old party politics was insufficient and changing and starting to reorient around a new axis at the turn of the 20th century. And for conservatives and unionists who were interested in what was increasingly seen as the rise of collectivism in this context, whether in thought or in policy, Disraeli, along with some earlier Tory factory reformers from the 1830s and 40s, so people like Lord Shaftesbury, were reimagined by early collectivists. Were reimagined as early collectivists by those who later in the century both supported and opposed an increased role for the state in addressing social problems. So on the one hand, famous individualists like the sociologist Herbert Spencer, the constitutional lawyer and thinker A.V. Dicey, who we saw before, who was also a liberal unionist, created a kind of retrospective genealogy from the mid-1880s that drew neat lines between the Tory factory reformers, Disraeli's novels of the 1840s, and especially Sybil, and then from there very neatly onto his administration of 1874 to 80, and specifically the year 1875, when a significant number of permissive social legislation was passed that was primarily the work of his Home Secretary, but is kind of firmly then connected in this kind of very neat genealogy of Tory social reform and thought. A story was constructed in which the Tories, seeking to redress the evils of industrial capitalism, had first generated the collectivist seed that individualists like Dicey and Spencer saw as strangling liberty in their own time. And a very similar story is being told by the social imperialists who used Disraeli to argue for a more interventionist and socially minded approach to conservative and unionist policy, both at home and in the empire. So most famous of these policies was, this is very timely, the introduction of tariffs at home and in the empire. So most famous of these figures were people like Joseph Chamberlain, Alfred Milner, who were politicians, were cabinet ministers, but were also colonial administrators. Milner is an interesting character in and of himself. But they saw they championed tariff reform as a means of uniting the empire, boosting employment, and funding new social policies. And a mythologized Disraeli also became a crucial resource for these figures within the unionist alliance, in terms of both kind of like specific policy justification, but also in that kind of broader reconfiguration of party identity that's going on at this time. And while it might be nice to think that politically facing people did all the work here, this is not quite what happened. So scholars in what was then the very nascent discipline of English literature also did some important recovery work in establishing Disraeli's Condition of England novels from the 1840s, including Sybil, as significant intellectual and historical texts. So there was a variety of new editions that were published. There was a lot of new literary criticism, which positioned Disraeli's novels, and especially Sybil, as situated not just in this Tory tradition of kind of alongside factory reformers and other Tories, but within this broader socially concerned tradition of novelists that included figures like Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell. And what's key here is the growing interest in the historic causes and effects of industrial capitalism. And so the equally new discipline of social and economic history plays a role too. So the first histories that were by liberals like Barbara and J.L. Hammond, and socialists like the Webbs, who were often described as pessimists, viewed the effects of industrialisation on the population as nasty, brutish, sudden. And they presented the Tory factory reformers and others, like Disraeli, as noble defenders of the condition of the people. Even more significantly, some of the most famous of these historians, so the Hammonds, whose influences, if you know your history of economic history, have an enormous influence. They effectively found the standard of living debate, which is still taught in economic history courses. They used Disraeli's analysis in Sybil on the division between the two nations of the rich and the poor as a conceptual framework for understanding the past, present and future of issues pertaining to wealth inequality, unemployment, class analysis, and also, after the First World War, reconstruction. Their analysis is circulated to audiences from workers' education courses to talks on the BBC. So Disraeli's association with social reform and a desire to unite the two nations of rich and the poor becomes a truism for conservatives, but also for liberals and socialists too. As a result, the interwar period is really the zenith of the mythologized Disraeli's fame and fortunes as a champion of the welfare of the people, but also as a Tory Democrat who had foreseen democratization and the need for greater imperial unity, as well as a tariff reformer. So just a note here, all of Disraeli's budgets after 1852 were free trade budgets. So this really did require some significant fudging. This legacy, however, was not confined to conservatives. So those within the Labour Party, as well as Marxist and socialist intellectuals, knew their Disraeli too. Claiming that the Conservatives were going against a Disraelian tradition and dividing the two nations becomes an important attack against the party in the 1930s, the 1960s, and again in the 1980s. The two nations, it was claimed, were not only the rich and the poor, but also the North and the South. And the founding of the One Nation group in 1950 is in one sense a crucial moment in Disraeli's reception history, because it's at this point that he becomes representative of a distinctly programmatic form of progressive conservative politics. However, the post-Second World War period is also one in which, thanks to decolonisation and just the simple passage of time from the passage of universal suffrage legislation, certain elements of the Disraeli myth just become less important and less relevant. And so what happens is a kind of further narrowing in terms of a more exclusive focus on social reform. From the mid-1950s, however, our mythologized Disraeli is increasingly blasted from those within and outside of the Conservative Party. And the type of politics and policies that he's being made to represent within, the conservative tradition. So there are people who really want to knock him off the central pillar in the pantheon of kind of conservatism. And it's in this context, from the mid-50s and then from the 70s, the alternative figures, historic figures, are dug up, as first Sir Robert Peel, and then later in the 70s, Lord Salisbury, find their kind of free market revivers and are made to represent alternative policy and party positions, both before and under Thatcher, especially. So taking a historical and specifically an active and targeted reception history approach to the construction of modern conservatism, whether Burkean or Disraelian, has allowed me to, I think, more precisely locate the kind of the when, the how and the why of invention, circulation, and the kind of the way that historic figures are kind of used in different ways in different periods. In the British context, with important interactions with European and American interlocutors, the late Victorian and Edwardian period was a time of really unrivaled significance in the construction and promotion of small c conservatism, as well as socialism and liberalism, as distinct bodies of thought that were in some sense removed from, although related to, contemporary political parties. It's in this period that Burke is first labelled the founder of conservatism, and his thought is distilled to the list that we would find on most syllabuses or Wikipedia today, with reflections and not, say, thoughts on the cause of the present discontents, positioned as his most representative text, as it was, 200 years ago. Likewise, it's here that, faced with a sense of the axis of party politics was moving, Disraeli was mythologized as a great statesman, a serious thinker, and an essential guide to modern social problems at home and in the empire. And while my work is primarily focused on a kind of British and Irish context, the reception of these thinkers was transnational. And indeed, part of the reason that certain interpretations gained power was because they were widely discussed and circulated, whether this was new interpretations of Burke in North America that drew on British Edwardian ones, or across the empire, or in award-winning Hollywood films like Disraeli. A crucial moment of Burke's reception, for example, is during the Cold War, as I've mentioned, when American scholars revived the term conservatism, which previously meant very little in an American context. And many followed the Edwardian British text, as I've mentioned, in seeing Burke as a founding father. And I would argue that my work is not just, I'm a historian, but my work is not just history or the past conceived as something separate from our own times. I think it can show how powerful interpretations and frameworks are established and put to work and that still shape our modern understanding of these people and these ideas. It also provides insights into both the historical contingency and relational nature of political ideologies, as well as the significant role that history and historical reconstruction has had in the invention and reinvention of conservatism for much of its history. I also think it shows the ways in which these interpretations still shape what we think that it is possible to do with certain thinkers like Burke. So, I'll start with the relational point. I think 99% of people think I work on the Conservative Party, or at least conservatism quite narrowly conceived. But in my work, I have entire chapters, sometimes multiple chapters, in which there are either no conservatives or party identity is fluid. I've already mentioned how examining the transformation of Burke and Disraeli's conservative reputations has also required understanding, changing understandings of Irishness and Jewishness. Many of Burke's earlier recoverers who sought to rescue him from charges of inconsistency were liberal men of letters. A great deal of Labour politicians, Marxists and socialists, not only in Britain, but elsewhere in Europe, identified in Disraeli, and particularly in his 1845 novel Sybil, a kind of early, if limited, source of socialist inspiration, and the two nations metaphor became an important analytical tool for them as well. Now, this is certainly the case in the UK, but it's a bit of a truism to say that we can't have a history of one party when they exist within a two or multi-party system. Whether it is ever enacted in practice or not is another question. But I think it's less common to hear this about political ideologies, and I'm sure that we can all think of histories or accounts of political ideologies that go from kind of A to Z. But both of my books, I think, have brought home this relational nature quite vividly. In Burke's case, for example, I mentioned, he was recovered as an important, consistent thinker by liberal intellectuals. And his political moment came in the Irish Home Rule debates of 1886, which again was a debate, which was a debate between liberals about liberal principles. So a vital moment in the transformation of Burke into the founder of conservatism with both a big C and a small c was analysis by liberals and a political debate among liberals about liberal principles. Similarly, in the case of Disraeli, new liberal and socialist historians of the Industrial Revolution were central in positioning Disraeli and other Tory factory reformers of the 1830s and 40s, as opposed to what was increasingly seen as a kind of inhumane, laissez-faire political economy and Manchester liberalism. These two traditions, I guess what we would now call classical liberalism, these two traditions were caricatured and mythologized at the same time as two sides of the same coin. The historical reconstruction of conservative figures like Burke and Disraeli, as well as the invention and kind of reinvention of conservatism, has by no means been the exclusive work of people within that tradition or ideology. And this has really brought home to me that across the political spectrum, history and historical reconstruction were not simply a kind of convenient source of political legitimation or a prop for a particular policy or idea. History provided, for much of the past 2 centuries, or maybe longer, a genuinely constructive intellectual force for imagining the past, present, and future. It both framed what could be conceived as possible, but provided a vital means of articulation and communication of goals and ideals. But this wasn't just done by political actors, and as I've said, my work has covered a wide range of topics from constitutional politics and higher thoughts to national character, publishing history, the ways in which Burke and Disraeli were taught, read, and represented in a variety of cultural productions, so literary criticism, historical plays, Hollywood films. And in the past few decades, a great deal of scholarship has sought to provide much more precise contextual readings of figures like Burke and Disraeli, which, within the history of political thought, which push back simplistic understandings of, for example, Burke as the founder of conservatism. But much less interest has been paid to the why, when, and how of the myth-making and construction that preceded it. Yet paying attention to these questions can tell us a great deal, as I've said, about how political traditions or ideologies are shaped and reshaped and the conditions in which this was done. So both my Burke and Disraeli books have really brought out to me the fundamentally relational and historically contingent nature of the traditions that I've studied. Second, the importance of broader kind of non or less partisan contexts and sources. And finally, the major significance of history and historical reconstruction in providing not just policy legitimation, but shaping the boundaries of what is conceived to be possible, as well as if not the fundamental cement of individual and group political and intellectual ideologies for much of the recent past. And I'm a historian, so when I say recent, I mean like 250 years. However, while the Burke book broadly covered kind of the end of the 18th century to kind of, around the First World War, the Disraeli book has brought me much closer to the present day. In the late 19th century, and for a long time afterwards, a more historicist mentality meant that the past, understood as a motive, living force, produced much deeper and more imaginative engagements with the past and figures like Burke and Disraeli. It created new canons, genealogies, and isms that, as I said, not only sought to explain the past, but to propose alternative futures. Moving from the 19th century through the 20th, I've been able to see the post-war decline of, and when I say post-war, I mean post-Second World War decline, of that more idealist, historicist mindset. And the shift, as so many contemporary historians like Josie Harris, Ben Jackson, Glory Liu, Charles Lockwood, and others have demonstrated, towards an alternative understanding of human nature as rooted in self-interest, and from there the effects on policy and policy development. PPE degrees began to replace history as the school of statesmanship from the 1980s, and scholars in political science now recognise that they have a history problem in a perceived inability to understand long-standing frameworks and discourses which structure modern political behaviour, discourse and policy. Conservatism in this context was increasingly and deliberately presented as non-ideological and simply a mindset. The Disraeli myths, as I mentioned, were blasted in this context in favour of new conservative heroes like Peel and Salisbury, especially under Thatcher's leadership. And Thatcher herself is obviously the conservative whose mantle is most frequently sought today, although conservatism seems to be on life support. The historian Emily Robinson has argued that while history does still matter to contemporary politics, and the legacies of previous administrations continue to shape ideas about what it is possible for governments to actually do. So I'd originally written at least in the UK, but then I was listening to the news this morning, and Trump is talking about the 1880s. In terms of his tariff proposals, so maybe it does still matter in America as well. Another product of this intellectual shift is what Robinson calls a growing presentism, and this presentism manifests for Robinson first in terms of an inability to engage with the past as a living force rather than as something separate, the past. And second, in an inability to conceive of a real imagined end point of future progress beyond kind of more limited narratives of kind of piecemeal social improvement. History becomes more like a prop, quite unlike the kind of engagement that you see earlier in the century. And I would add that I think the kind of the dearth of, the kind of move away from talking about broader ideologies like conservatism or socialism or liberalism, and the dearth of kind of serious ideas to match some of the challenges of the present you can see it even just in kind of the personalized singularity in the terms that the isms that people use in modern political writing and commentary. So from the past kind of few years, we had Johnsonism, Corbynism, Starmerism, Farageism, and then obviously Trumpism. So kind of trying to extract bigger ideas from individuals or vice versa. Writing this last book then confirmed in my mind that the isms are historically contingent, but that we've also seemed to have lost some of our ability to think historically. And so we've also kind of lost the ability to think with traditions or ideologies in the same way as those who invented and reinvented them in the past. And I did, by the end of January, by the time I sent the manuscript off, I was quite sure of this. But I wanted to end on a positive note, because there are still historians in the world. But also, what I love about this type of work is that it actually takes all kinds of people to invent and reinvent an ism. Academics, political actors, journalists, students, teachers, playwrights, filmmakers, and so many more. So while on the one hand, I would argue that there's nothing kind of eternal about conservatism or any other ideology, on the other, there is nothing inevitable about when this might happen or what might succeed them. So thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much, Emily. That was excellent. Now it's time for the Q&A session. And for people here in the room, you raise your hand if you want to ask a new question, and you raise a finger if you want to ask a follow-up.
Can I borrow a pen,
yeah,
please?
Sure.
Thank you.
Thanks. And for the online audience, we will use the chat function. So right hand and finger in the chat, depending on what you want to do. And also, since we are a broad variety of people and many new people, please tell us your name and your discipline. So, the first name on the list is, voila, Gustav.
Thank you very much. So I'm a moral and political philosopher, also running this place. So thank you very much for this fascinating reconstruction of Burke and Disraeli. typically maybe for a political philosopher, I would ask whether it would be possible to say a bit more about the ideas, the values, the principles that they kind of dug out from Burke and Disraeli in these different reconstructions, and like freedom versus equality, self-determination, nationalism. And also I wondered about how much, at least for Disraeli, did they play in this kind of growing both liberalism and working class movements and socialism, and was there a kind of reaction to that they used Disraeli for to bring up those ideas? That's why I would like to hear more about, if it's possible.
Can I just clarify? So they used Disraeli as a reaction to some of the conservative.
I don't know the reaction, but I guess it must be some kind of, if there's a working class movement coming up, and then you have people who identify as conservatives, I guess they were perhaps interested in Disraeli's idea to counter some of the claims of socialism and the working class movement, I would guess.
Yeah, great, thank you. So on that, yeah, that's exactly what happened. So Disraeli basically became a source for conservatives and unionists to argue that actually it was conservatives who were the true friends of the people, and that's why the simultaneous characterization of liberalism as kind of nasty, laissez-faire, individualist actually becomes useful for a number of conservatives and unionists who want to argue that actually the conservatives are socialist in the sense that they understand the basic unit of society is not the individual. So not in terms of any redistributive policies or anything like that, but the idea that there is a kind of socialist tradition within conservative. Not all conservatives, obviously, but there are even there are lots of people who kind of start out as conservatives and then end up becoming socialists because they kind of realize that actually the conservatives would never actually go as far as they. As far as they would want to. But you see this in, figures like Henry Heinemann and, Beatrice Webb and other people kind of start out as kind of Disraelian conservatives. I think Alistair McIntyre as well. So there are people kind of start out as Disraelian conservatives and then kind of and end up just deciding a bit like with Burke, it's insufficient. It doesn't quite go as far as I want it to go. So, but he still remains, I guess to this day, a kind of an important kind of people would mention One Nation or something to kind of go back to this idea that, But it rests on a mythologization that kind of very much over eggs what Disraeli actually did. I don't go as far as some of the myth busters who kind of basically go back to that kind of view of Disraeli as just like opportunistic and whatever. Like Disraeli had principles, but they're not quite the ones that he's made to stand for today. And on terms of the ideas that were dug out, so I guess a kind of like shifting from the kind of Whig constitutionalism of present discontents and things like that towards, focusing on a particular understanding of his constitutional thought that was gradual, but in some sense limited, in that he didn't want to progress beyond, 1688 or whatever, but also increasingly to focus on a kind of Burke becomes very important for kind of the historians who are interested in the development from ideas from status to contract, and then Burke becomes an important figure for lots of people as one of the first people that moves away from contract theory. So for lots of the historicists at the end of the 19th century, whether they're philosophers or economists or whoever, they become interested in Burke and kind of reframe him as, someone who had a kind of organic historicist conception of society and things like that. And then, essentially the things that we talk about in terms of Burkean conservatism were all kind of extracted at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century by some people who were philosophers, some people who were conservative thinkers like Cecil, and they all kind of deviated towards the kind of same analysis that we now kind of see as defining, Burkean conservatism in that narrow sense.
Can I follow up? Or? Sure. Okay. Just a quick follow-up. I mean, you mentioned McIntyre. There is a kind of funny thing that this kind of criticism of modern liberalism, like in political philosophy, like Rawls and other, and then come up to the idea of communitarianism, which is very much about this community, although they want to see themselves as progressive. So it's kind of a strange kind of funny mix of that.
Yeah, but if you read like the preface to Raymond Williams' Culture and Society, he's like, oh, I have no idea where these ideas came from. I just came with them myself. And I was like they were talking about this 50 years ago. So I think that there's almost like a kind of like false invention narrative that's created at this time when all of these ideas were very much here. Like, one of the most significant texts that kind of does that is Louis Kazemian's the social novel in England. It's in French, but I won't subject you to my French accent. Kind of does all of this stuff. So there's, and I think that what you can see with lots of kind of like Marxist and socialist thought in the post-Second World War period is very much that interest in history, the significance of the Industrial Revolution, and kind of and these ideas too. You see it in and it comes through in things like the New Left Review and Marxist Today and all of these things. And you see Disraeli and the Two Nations in all of these publications as well. So he really does exist in quite different traditions, standing for quite similar, being made to stand for quite similar things, but used in engaged with it quite seriously with different types of people, like well into the 20th century.
Thank you very much.
I forgot to say that the first 30 minutes of this Q&A session is being recorded, so you know. Next question is from Yasmina.
Thanks
Hi.
a lot. I'm a political theorist, and I was quite intrigued by those early liberal interpreters of Burke that you mentioned.
Yeah.
So for what purposes did they use Burke, and how did they employ him for their purposes?
So these are figures like John Morley, Leslie Stephen, who's probably best known now as Virginia Woolf's dad, and I always like that. Like he was like the leading man of letters in the 19th century after Matthew Arnold died, but he's best remembered as Virginia Woolf's dad, and his brother James Fitzjames Stephen are probably kind of three key figures here. So they're all men who went to university, so they went to kind of Oxford or Cambridge, but they went through a crisis of faith, which meant that in that context they either had to break ties with their families and kind of lose financial support. They had to leave their degree programs, or they kind of, or they finished their degrees and then they sort of like, they didn't go into the career paths that they were supposed to, like go into the clergy or whatever, because, there were religious restrictions on what you could do if you weren't an Anglican for a lot of the 19th century in Britain. So they all go into what becomes known as higher journalism. So they write for periodicals and things that are all kind of like organs of kind of higher thought in the 19th century. And they become very interested in they draw their thought from various sources of inspiration. So Morley was a kind of a friend of John Stuart Mill. Leslie Stephen was very interested in Darwin and other thinkers. So they're kind of eclectic, and they in that they mix. They're very interested in positivism and Comte, and they're interested in Mill, and they're interested in evolutionary theory. So they sort of they have, they work in, some of them will have, work in, kind of imperial governance and legislation and law, because Fitzjames Stephen is a barrister. So they draw together like lots of kind of eclectic mixes. And one thing that they get from the positivists is a sense of the significance of the French Revolution, not just as an important kind of moment in political history, but as a kind of moving on from the next kind of stage in intellectual history, the history of ideas. And so this means that they become much more interested in Burke as a thinker than anyone kind of earlier, and they become much more interested in his French writings. But as liberals, they still prefer his Irish writings, his American speeches, and his writings on India, and the Empire, and his Whig texts. So obviously most Whigs are liberals by this point in the 19th century in terms of kind of party names. So they become interested in Burke because of that. So Morley's first text, Edmund Burke, is quite kind of very much draws from that kind of like Comtean tradition, whereas someone like Leslie Stephen is much more interested in Darwin. So in his History of English Thought in the 18th century, which was published in 1874, he is very much interested in Burke as a kind of proto-Darwinian kind of evolutionary thinker. Burke kind of becomes of interest because of the kind of the circumstances of these particular types of figures, but also because like they don't have a profession and they need to earn money through writing. So it kind of also kind of drives a lot of kind of, so for example, James Fitzjames Stephen published a series of articles on the history of political thought in the Saturday Review, which is one of the most significant reviews. So it's a combination of they are intellectually interested in these things, but there is also a need to earn money, so these things get published as well. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, thank you. Is it possible to follow up a little bit? So was it more that they were impressed by a method that Burke used in order to justify various positions, rather than agreeing with him on some substantive conclusions?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of the two. So, for example, the speeches on American taxation and conciliation from the mid-1770s are kind of held up as, Burke's writing throughout all of this is held up as almost kind of like a master course in political eloquence. And so Burke kind of survives the Dark Ages because he is still seen to be such a fantastic writer. So I think in some ways, his writing and particular forms of argumentation, like in the American speeches, is held up by these figures as almost like a perfect examples of how you do things. I guess it goes back to that theme of sufficiency. So for lots of these liberals, they say things like Burke was right on three things, but not this, and things like that. Burke was right on America, India, and Ireland, but not on France, and things like that. So they will kind of they tend to argue that Burke was broadly consistent, but that there are things that are insufficient for liberals then in the 1860s and 70s. So it's partly about method and partly about drawing inspiration from his approach, both in terms of his rhetoric and his writing, as well as his actual ideas. But there's a process of modernization that's going on where they're saying, but this isn't quite enough after, the 1832 Reform Act and the 1867 Reform Act, where, party politics and the political constitution and and parliamentary government has changed vastly beyond what Burke considered to be possible without society crumbling, and that's not happened. So so Burke was wrong about that. So it's a bit of both. Thank you.
Thank you. So next person on the list is Andy, right?
Thanks. Yeah, I just wonder. I mean, I agree with you that I assume this is your view, that the most interesting kind of conservatism is Burke's, or maybe you don't have a view on that question. So I'm Andy Hamilton from Durham. I teach philosophy. But in any case, who was a conservative before the late 19th century, and what was conservatism? So is your view that conservatism began with Burke, but that it was only with his appropriation by conservatives with a big C in the late 19th century? So in other words, I would think conservatism began with, there's such a thing as traditional conservatism, goes back to beyond Aristotle or whatever, right? But then that's not terribly interesting. But there's Burkean conservatism. It has some interesting arguments. It is a distinctive position. But when does it begin? I assumed it began with the publication of his books at the time of the French Revolution, at a time when there's a contrast to be made for conservative thinkers with Jacobinism. But it looks like you think that it's 100 years later. So in which case, what was conservatism between 1790 and the appropriation that you're describing?
So, well, I guess it's like, the historian to a philosopher would say, if a tree falls in a forest and no one hears it, does it really exist? because nobody understood it nobody thought of conservatism in that way at that time in Britain. So, people understood, there wasn't even really a party system. People understood there to be Whig ideas and Tory ideas. But they weren't described of as conservative. If you read someone like Richard Burke or David Bromwich on Burke, I guess the point that they would make, and I guess other people who've looked at the reception history of people like Locke and Adam Smith, so like Glory Liu and Claire Arsenis, is that part of calling Burke a conservative or Smith a libertarian or Locke a liberal is that it's a kind of narrowing of their thoughts.
You could call them a proto-liberal, which is what I would do, or a proto-conservative, or maybe.
Yeah, but someone like Richard Burke would argue that that Burke's thought was not just, you can't just call Burke a conservative. David Bromwich said that something like, it was quite incendiary, but he said something like no serious scholar would call Burke a conservative. In the sense that his thought is so much, I don't know if I agree with that, but in the sense that his thought is so much kind of broader than just conservatism. There's a kind of sense that the term narrows kind of a description of his thought, which is much wider than that.
Just briefly, when you say it's a philosopher, an historian talking to a philosopher, you're thinking that philosophers, which is true, many of the analytic ones are, they suffer from the disease of presentism. They are ahistorical, or they think of philosophy as ahistorical. Well, there are a few of us who don't take that view.
I know, and I do work with some of them.
Oh, good. Okay. Well, okay. Yes. Okay. Well, pass
Yeah.
it to someone else then.
But I think my point is that there is not just one tradition of conservatism. So, for example, the reason, for example, if you were kind of in obviously what is now Germany at the beginning of the 19th century, you had a more limited number of texts of Burke that you had. You had no experience of him throwing daggers around the House of Commons. You had Sublime and Beautiful.
He did that, did he?
Oh yeah. It was, yeah. There's good satirical prints if you're interested.
Yeah.
And apparently someone responded by shouting, "Where's the fork?" So I didn't quite have the effect that he intended. But I think, you know, so if you think like in a German context, they had Sublime and Beautiful, and they had Gentz's translation of Reflections. So the kind of the German Burke is different to the British Burke, and you know, and so kind of there isn't just one conservative Burke that emerges at exactly the same time. There are different conservative Burkes that are the product of access to knowledge about and him as a person, but also to texts. So, you know, whether certain editions and translations and knowledge is available in different places in the 19th century means that there are different versions of conservatism that emerge at different times in different places, and different versions of Burke.
Thank you. Next person on the list is Eric. There are two Erics, but Eric Cheng first, and then.
Thanks. I'm Eric. I'm a philosopher and historian. So my question is, how important do you think this kind of myth-making around individual figures is for imposing unity to a range of thought that one needn't have seen as unified under one label as conservatism or whatever. And I think this is particularly apparent if you compare the British case with other continental countries, where, and no doubt this is related to the nature of the electoral and political system, that there's this imperative to construct one ideology for a party in Britain that there isn't in certain other countries, in Germany or in Sweden. And whether you think there's a difference between Burke and Disraeli here. So Burke is often seen as defining for whether this be any sort of conservative. I think in, for instance, Samuel Huntington's paper on conservatism, he says, well, conservatism can be defined very easily. Here are the 6 things that it is, and it's what Burke believed. And this is not an uncommon thing to think. But can the contrast be drawn between Burke as the myth-making around Burke as intended to bring about this kind of unity, and the myth-making around Disraeli as focused on more one tradition within conservatism, which might, in the continent, have more ended up more narrowly as Christian democracy or something like that. And you evoke the alternative figures like Peel that people might have appealed to in Britain.
Yeah, and I think that unlike Disraeli, Burke has the kudos of making an extremely significant intervention in what became the most significant moment in modern European history. And, you know, Disraeli has no claim to that, like, whatsoever. So part of Burke's reception is also about the history of the historiography of the French Revolution and the changing way in which the French Revolution was understood, both in Britain but elsewhere as well. You know, we often think of the French Revolution as if it was seen as like this like singular event, but actually for a long time, you know, no one was really sure how to interpret the French Revolution. Was it a good thing or a bad thing? And, you know, and I think, you know, that's part of why Burke has, you know, a more international significance than someone like Disraeli, but also why there are more Burkes than there are probably Disraelis. And I think that Burke still serves that role, right? I think there's still the Edmund Burke Institute. I think Georgia Maloney described herself as a Burkean conservative recently. So, you know, yeah, like Burke, I think Burke obviously has a kind of name recognition, and I think what's really important is that Burke produced texts which are still seen as texts in the history of political thought. What happened in, like, the idea that you could just read a novel like Sybil as just the expression of Disraeli's own political thought, as if that would have survived like post-Second World War literary criticism. Like the idea that you could just treat novels as straightforward texts like that just, you know, doesn't survive any disciplinary developments in the post-Second World War period. So Disraeli is not only blasted for his kind of presentation as a social reformer and kind of, you know, planner in the Conservative Party, but also because the foundations of that thought are kind of deemed to no longer be kind of usable in the way that they were before the Second World War. So Disraeli is still important, but I think one of the reasons why there is a kind of there is a shift towards the term one nation is because it increasingly began to encapsulate a broader tradition of people, like the Wets who opposed Thatcher in the 80s and things like that. So it wasn't just about Disraeli anymore, it was about other Conservatives too.
Can I briefly follow up? Yeah, so I was actually more interested in the historical issue in the 19th century, whether Burke was being used to unify different people and Disraeli maybe was being used partly to draw a contrast. So you might think that Burke, the myth-making around Burke is helpful for conservatives who want to integrate people from a whole range, from the traditional kind of church and crown Toryism to people who came into the Conservative Party like Derby even, or people like that, up to Joseph Chamberlain. Whereas, do you think already in the 19th century there was a conscious construction of Disraeli as a Tory Democrat, and that was opposed to certain other kinds of people in the Conservative Party?
Yeah, like that's what the book is. That's one of the chapters in the book. Yeah. So what happens is that aspects of Disraeli's life that were kind of contentious or unclear become kind of like moulded into a very distinct and overblown version of that. So whatever happened in passing the 1867 Reform Act, for example, so whether Disraeli just wanted to dish the Whigs or whether he had some sort of like more serious view on the deficiencies of the 1832 Reform Act, Disraeli then, after his death, is kind of totally blown up as this Tory Democrat who had foreseen the coming of, you know, of later democratisation and kind of trusted in the conservative nature of the people and things like that. So the historic Disraeli's ideas are, which, you know, were often very contentious at the time, were kind of you know, mythologized and blown up after his lifetime, and Burke is a complicated figure for conservatives because there are conservatives, usually Irish Tories, who like Burke's French writings, they like Reflections, they like the letters to a regicide peace, you know, but he also wrote The Appeal from the New to the Old Whigs, where he, you know, defended himself like the Liberal Unionists do in 1886, that they are sticking by what they understand to be Whig and later Liberal principles. So there are parts of Burke that Conservatives and Tories do use earlier in the 19th century. But the point is that Burke is divided. So there are bits of Burke that the Whigs and the Liberal use, like the American speeches and the thoughts on the cause of the present discontents. And there are bits of Burke that Tories like, which is Reflections. What happens from the 1860s and 70s is that Burke becomes a consistent, united thinker across the political spectrum. And it is increasingly decided that it is Reflections that is his most representative text. So it's not that conservatives don't have a Burke earlier in the 19th century, but it's a limited one that they can't kind of claim Burke, and they don't want to either, because because people still think he's a nutter. So like there's a kind of claiming Burke earlier in the 19th century is complicated for Whigs and Liberals, but also for Tories and for Conservatives.
Thank you very much. Time is up, so join me in thanking Emily for this
Thank you.
excellent talk.
Thank you.
And coming up, research seminars here at the Institute is April 23, Eva Ehrman, Why Feasibility Need Not and Should Not Be a Moralized Notion. And May 7, Andreas Dewitt to be announced, and May 14, Jens Rydgren also to be announced. And before we leave, may I just welcome you all to continue joining our workshop Conservatism on the contemporary perspectives of conservatism. That has now just started with Emily's excellent talk. So 1300 sharp, we start again, and warmly welcome. Thanks.
Thank you.